himself. And then he would dance round, flicking his fingers and cursing the things. George and I thought at first it was all part of the culinary arrangements. Montmorency got his nose over the pan once, and the fat sputtered up and scolded him, and he started dancing and cursing. Altogether, it was one of the most interesting and exciting operations I've ever witnessed. George and I were both quite sorry when it was over. The result wasn't altogether the success that Harris had predicted. There seemed to be so little to show for the business. 6 eggs had gone into the pan, but all that came out was a teaspoonful of burnt and unappetizing-looking mess. Harris said it was the fault of the frying pan. He said he thought it would have gone better if we'd had a fish kettle and a gas stove, and we resolved not to attempt the dish again until we had these aids to housekeeping by us. From Picnic Point to Old Windsor is one of the loveliest stretches of the river. A shady road runs by the bank up to the Bells of Ouseley, a picturesque inn where a very good glass of ale may be had, so Harris says, and on a matter of this kind you can take Harris's word. Edward the Confessor had a palace at Old Windsor. And here the Earl of Godwin was tried, according to the custom of that age, for encompassing the death of the king's brother. Earl Godwin took a piece of bread and said, "If I am guilty, may this bread choke me when I eat it." And he put the bread in his mouth and swallowed it, and it choked him and he died. We tugged away steadily up to a little below Monkey Island and stopped there for some lunch. We tackled the cold beef for lunch, and then found we'd forgotten to bring in mustard. I don't think I ever in my life, before or since, wanted mustard as much as I'd wanted it then. I don't care for mustard as a rule, but I'd have given worlds for it then. It cast a gloom over the whole boat. We ate our beef in silence. We brightened up a bit, however, over the apple tart, and when George drew a tin of pineapple from the bottom of the hamper and rolled it into the middle of the boat, we thought that life was worth living after all. We're very fond of pineapple, all three of us, and we looked at the picture on the tin, and we thought of the juice, and we smiled at one another. And Harris got ready with a spoon. Then we looked for the knife to open the tin with. We turned out the hamper, we turned out all the bags, we looked under the boards at the bottom of the boat, we took everything out onto the bank and shook it. There was no tin opener to be found. Harris tried to open the tin with a pocket knife, but broke the knife and cut himself badly. Then George tried a pair of scissors, but the scissors flew up and nearly put his eye out. While they were dressing their wounds, I tried to make a hole in the thing with the spiky end of the hitcher, but the hitcher slipped and jerked me out between the boat and the bank into 2 foot of muddy water, and the tin rolled over unharmed and broke a cup. After that, we all got mad. We took that tin out onto the bank, and Harris got a big sharp stone, and I brought the mast from out of the boat. And George held the tin, and Harris put the sharp point of the stone on it, and I took that mast up above my head and brought it down with all my force. It was George's straw hat that saved his life that day. He keeps that hat now, what is left of it, and of a winter evening he'll bring it down and show it round, and the stirring tale is told again, with fresh exaggerations every time. Harris escaped with merely a flesh wound. After that, I hammered away at the tin with the mast until I was worn out. Then Harris had a go. We beat it out flat. We beat it square. We hammered it into every shape known to geometry. But we could not make a hole in it. At length, George knocked it into a shape so strange, so weird, so unearthly in its wild hideousness that he got frightened and threw away the mast. Then we all sat round on the grass and stared at the thing. there was one great dent across the top that had the appearance of a mocking grin, and it drove us furious. And Harris rushed at the tin and picked it up and flung it far into the river, and as it sank we hurled our curses after it and got into the boat and rowed away from the spot and never stopped until we reached Maidenhead. That night at Marlow we put up at the Crown, and the following day we re-victualled for 3 days. Later in the morning, however, at Hambledon Lock, we found we were short of water. So we took a jar and went up to the lockkeeper's house to beg for some. George put on a winning smile and said, "Excuse me, do you think we could possibly have some water?" "Certainly," said the man. "Take as much as you want and leave the rest." "That's awfully kind of you," said George. "Where do you keep it?" "Why, it's always in the same place, my boy. Right behind you." "I'm sorry, I don't see it," said George. "Bless us, where's your eyes? There's enough of it there to see, ain't there?" Oh, but we can't drink the river, you know," said George. "No, but you can drink some of it. It's what I've drunk for the last 15 years. George told the man that his appearance wasn't a sufficiently good advertisement for the brand, and we'd prefer it out of a pump. We tried river water once that year, but it wasn't a success. George said it would be all right for tea, providing we made sure to boil it properly. So we put the kettle on to boil, and having filled it, and very careful we were to see that it did boil. We made the tea, and were just settling down comfortably to drink it, when George, with his cup halfway to his lips, suddenly cried out, "What's that?" Harris and I followed his gaze, and saw, floating down towards us on the sluggish current, a dog. It was one of the quietest and peacefullest dogs I've ever seen. I never saw a dog more contented, more easy in its own mind. It was floating dreamily on its back with its forelegs stuck up into the air. On it came, serene, dignified and calm, until it got abreast of the boat, and there, among the rushes, it settled in cosily for the evening. Harris didn't want any tea after that. Emptied his cup into the water. George wasn't thirsty either and followed suit. I drunk half mine, but I wished I had not. I asked George if he thought I should have typhoid, but he said no, he thought I had a very good chance of escaping it, but I should know in about a fortnight whether I had or not. We got out and roamed around for an hour at Sunning, and it then being too late to push on past Reading, we settled for the night, and George suggested that with the remains of the beef and the vegetables and other odds and ends from the hamper, we should make an Irish stew. It seemed a fascinating idea. So while George got some sticks together and made a fire, Harris and I began to peel the potatoes. We put in cabbage and peas, and we overhauled the hampers and got out various odds and ends and remnants. There was a pork pie, I remember, and a bit of bacon, and we put them in. And George found half a tin of potted salmon and emptied that into the pot. George said that was the advantage of an Irish stew. One got rid of such a lot of things. I don't remember all the other ingredients, but I know nothing was wasted. But towards the end, Montmorency, who had evinced a great interest in the proceedings, strolled away, coming back a few minutes later with a dead water rat. Evidently wishing to present that as his contribution. We debated whether we should put it in. Harris said he thought we wouldn't notice it mixed up with all the other things. But George said he'd never heard of a water rat in an Irish stew, and he held out for precedent. Harris said, "Why don't you try it? It's people like you that hold back the progress of the world. Think of the man that first tried black pudding." It was a great success, that Irish stew. There was something so fresh and piquant about it. One's palate gets bored of the old hackneyed things. Here was a dish with a new flavour and a taste like nothing else on earth. George wanted to play the banjo after supper, but Harris said he had a headache and didn't think he had the strength to stand it. George thought that the music might do him good, said music often soothed the nerves and took a headache away, and he twanged 2 or 3 notes to show Harris what it was like. Harris said he'd rather have the headache. George never has learned to play the banjo to this day. He's had too much all-round discouragement to meet. Harris's language alone would have been enough to deter any man, added to which Montmorency would sit and howl right the way through the performance. "What does he want to howl like that for when I'm playing?" George would say. "What do you want to play like that for when he's howling?" Harris would say. Harris was disagreeable after supper. I think it must have been the Irish stew. So George and I settled to go for a mooch round Henley. We were to shout from the opposite bank when we returned, and Harris would row over from the island where we had moored and fetch us. "Don't go to sleep, old man," we said as we left. It was nearly 11 o'clock before we set out on our 4-mile walk home. It was a dismal night, coldish with a thin rain falling, and as we trudged through the fields we thought of the cosy boat and of the bright light streaming out through the tight-drawn canvas, and of Harris and Montmorency and the whisky, and we wished that we were there. "You don't happen to remember which island it was, do you?" said George. "No," I said. "How many are there?" "Oh, only 4, he said. "It'll be all right if he's awake." "And if not?" I queried. We shouted when we got opposite the first island, but met with no success. So we went on and tried the second, with a similar result. "Oh, I remember now," said George. "It was the 3rd one." We ran on hopefully and hallooed. No answer. The case was becoming serious. It was now well past midnight. We shouted opposite what seemed to us in the darkness to be the 4th island, but met with no better success. The rain was coming down hard now. We were soaked to the skin and cold and miserable. We began to wonder whether we were in the wrong part of the river altogether. Everything seemed so strange and different in the blackness. Just when we had given up all hope, I suddenly saw, a little way below us, a strange, weird sort of glimmer flickering among the trees on the opposite bank, and I sent up such a yell that the night seemed to shake in its bed. We waited breathless for a moment, and then, oh, divinest of music of the night, we heard the answering bark of Montmorency. We shouted loud enough then to wake the 7 sleepers. After what seemed an hour, we saw the lighted boat creeping slowly across the blackness, and heard Harris's sleepy voice asking us where we were. There was an unaccountable strangeness about Harris. It was something more than ordinary mere tiredness. When at last we got back into the boat, he had a sad expression on him. He gave you the idea of a man who has seen trouble. We asked him whether anything had happened, and he said, "Swans." He said a female swan and her old man had come up to the boat, and he'd had quite a fight with them. But courage and skill had prevailed in the end, and he defeated them. Half an hour later, he'd returned with 18 other swans. They tried to drag him and Montmorency into the water and drown them. He'd fought them like a hero for 4 hours and killed the lot. "How many swans did you say there were?" said George. 32, said Harris. "You said 18 just now," said George. "No, I didn't. I said 12. Think I can't count?" What the truth was about these swans we never did discover. We asked Harris about it the following morning, but he said, "What swans?" He seemed to think that George and I had been dreaming. Oh, how good it was to be back in the cosy boat. We made a hearty supper, and we'd have had some toddy after it if we could have found the whisky, but we couldn't. We questioned Harris closely as to what he'd done with it, but he didn't seem to know what we meant by whisky, or what we were talking about at all. We slept late the following morning, and then decided that we would pull as a change from towing. Harris suggested that George and I should row and he should steer. I didn't chime in with this idea at all. I thought that he and George should row and let me rest a bit. It seemed to me I was doing far too much work on this trip.